To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, we'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Foundations of Stone. The concrete dust settled on Dominic Dunn's work boots as he surveyed the half-built foundation. To anyone watching, he was just another construction foreman, his hands calloused from years of manual labor, his face weathered by sun and sweat. The workers respected him. He knew every aspect of the job, from mixing concrete to reading blueprints, and he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. But Dominic Dunn was not just any construction worker. 15 years ago, he had been a different man entirely. Fresh out of MIT with dual degrees in engineering and business, he'd married his college sweetheart, Angelica Paul, in a ceremony that cost more than most people's annual salary. They'd been the golden couple, she with her marketing degree and ambitious social climbing, he with his brilliant mind and natural leadership. Together, they'd built what seemed like the perfect life in their suburban mansion. The construction company had started as a side venture, something to keep him grounded while he navigated the corporate world. Dunn Construction, he called it, a small operation that handled residential projects. Angelica had rolled her eyes at his blue-collar hobby, preferring to focus on his rapid ascent through the ranks of Morrison Industries, where he'd quickly become the youngest vice president in company history. But Angelica had grown restless. The dinner parties, charity galas, and country club memberships weren't enough. She wanted more attention, more excitement, more of everything. Dominic had been too focused on building their future to notice the signs until it was too late. The divorce papers had been waiting on his desk on a Tuesday afternoon, along with photos that made his blood run cold. Angelica with Rich Cole, the charismatic CEO of Cole Enterprises, in compromising positions spanning months. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. Not just the adultery, but the calculated way she'd planned their separation. She'd taken half of everything visible: the house, the cars, the joint accounts. What she hadn't known about were the offshore investments, the shell companies, or the fact that Dunn Construction was far more than a hobby. "Boss, we're ready for the next pour," called out Brandon Hutchins, his site supervisor, and one of the few people who suspected there was more to Dominic than met the eye. Dominic nodded, pulling himself back to the present. "Let's get it done before the weather turns." As the concrete truck rumbled to life, Dominic's phone buzzed. A text message from his personal assistant. "The Blackstone acquisition is complete. You now own 60% of all commercial real estate in the downtown district." He deleted the message without changing expression. Angelica thought he'd fallen from grace, reduced to manual labor after their divorce. She had no idea that in the past 3 years, he'd systematically acquired properties, businesses, and influence across the city. The construction worker facade was perfect. Who would suspect a man covered in concrete dust of being one of the most powerful individuals in the state? The irony wasn't lost on him. While she'd been busy climbing social ladders with Rich Cole, Dominic had been building an empire from the ground up. Literally. Chapter 2. The Queen's New Castle. Angelica Cole, she'd taken Rich's name even before their engagement was official, adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet as she surveyed the ballroom of the Riverside Country Club. The charity auction for the Children's Hospital was the social event of the season, and she intended to make sure everyone remembered her presence. "Darling, you look absolutely stunning," Rich Cole murmured in her ear, his arm possessively around her waist. At 45, Rich was 10 years older than Angelica, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from inherited wealth. Cole Enterprises had been in his family for 3 generations, and Rich had never known anything but privilege. "Thank you, sweetheart," Angelica purred, though her eyes were already scanning the room for more important conversations. She spotted Judge Patrick Hayden near the bar. His wife had been instrumental in getting Angelica accepted into the exclusive Riverside Garden Club. Senator Jody Sherman was holding court by the auction display, surrounded by potential donors. This was Angelica's world now. The world she'd always deserved, but had been held back from by Dominic's middle-class sensibilities. Sure, he'd been successful at Morrison Industries, but he'd never understood the importance of appearance, of being seen with the right people. His idea of networking had been playing poker with his construction buddies or attending industry conferences. "The Hendersons just bid $50,000 on the Hawaii vacation package," Rich commented, nodding toward the auction board. "Should we outbid them?" Of course, Angelica replied without hesitation. Money was no object now. Rich's company generated over $100 million in revenue annually, and he spared no expense in keeping her happy. The Maserati in the driveway, the shopping trips to New York, the winter home in Aspen, these were the things that mattered. She thought briefly of Dominic, probably coming home covered in dirt and exhaustion. The divorce settlement had been generous enough to ensure he could maintain a modest lifestyle, but she'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd never recovered from the split. Some people just weren't built for success. Mrs. Cole, interrupted Crystal Estes, the auction coordinator, we have a special lot coming up that I thought might interest you. A private wine tasting at the Morrison estate, donated by their new CEO. Angelica's smile faltered slightly. Morrison Industries, where Dominic used to work. She'd heard rumors that the company had undergone some major changes since his departure, new ownership or something. How lovely, she managed, though the mention of his former workplace left a bitter taste. Rich squeezed her hand. You're 1,000 miles away, Angel. What's wrong? Nothing important, she said, forcing brightness back into her voice. Just thinking about how far we've come. As the evening progressed, Angelica worked the room with practiced precision. She complimented Judge Hayden's wife on her recent renovation, discussed upcoming political campaigns with Senator Sherman, and made sure to be photographed with every influential person in attendance. This was her talent, reading people, understanding power dynamics, positioning herself at the center of everything that mattered. When Marla Stevenson, the mayor's wife, mentioned seeing that construction worker who used to be married to you at a job site downtown, Angelica barely suppressed her disdain. I wish Dominic well, of course, she said with perfect diplomatic grace. Some people are just meant for simpler lives. But as she said it, she felt a twinge of something, not regret exactly, but a strange unease. Dominic had always been unpredictable, even in their marriage. There had been depths to him she'd never fully understood, business dealings he'd kept private. For just a moment, she wondered if she really knew what had become of her ex-husband. Then Rich's hand found hers again, his gold Rolex catching the ballroom lights, and the moment passed. She was Angelica Cole now, and this was her world. Chapter 3, The Moment of Truth. The charity auction had reached its crescendo. Over $2 million had been raised for the Children's Hospital, and the social elite of the city basked in their collective generosity. Angelica felt the familiar thrill of being at the center of it all, her laughter ringing across the ballroom as Rich regaled their table with stories of his latest business conquests. And then I told the contractor, Rich was saying, gesturing with his scotch, if you can't handle the timeline, I'll find someone who can. These blue-collar types, they need firm management. Judge Hayden nodded approvingly. Absolutely right. Can't let them think they're running the show. Angelica was about to add her own comment when she noticed a commotion near the entrance. Several guests had turned to stare, and she followed their gaze to see a familiar figure standing uncomfortably by the registration table. Oh my God, she whispered, then louder, unable to suppress her delight. Rich, look who decided to show up. Dominic stood near the entrance in an ill-fitting suit that had clearly seen better days. His hair was shorter than she remembered, and his hands, those hands that had once worn an expensive wedding ring, showed the calluses and dirt stains of manual labor. He looked lost, out of place among the glittering crowd. Is that your ex-husband? Rich asked, following her gaze. The construction worker? The very same, Angelica said, her voice carrying just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Oh, this is priceless. She watched as Dominic approached the auction table, clearly uncertain about the protocols. The sight of his discomfort filled her with a mixture of vindication and pity. This was the man who had once thought he could keep her satisfied with a suburban lifestyle and middle management salary. Should we go say hello? Rich suggested, his tone suggesting he found the situation amusing. Absolutely, Angelica said, rising from her chair with predatory grace. They approached Dominic just as he was examining the auction catalog, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he looked up and saw them approaching, his expression remained carefully neutral. Dominic, Angelica said with exaggerated warmth. What a lovely surprise to see you here. Angelica, he replied simply, then nodded to Rich. Cole, I didn't expect to see you at this type of event, she continued, her smile sharp. I mean, the ticket price alone is more than most people make in a month. Rich chuckled. Maybe he's here for the construction work. I heard they're renovating the kitchen. He's working construction now. Angelica explained to Judge Hayden and the others who had gathered around. How the mighty have fallen. She laughed, the sound carrying across the ballroom. Dominic's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing. It must be quite an adjustment, Rich added, warming to the topic. From a corner office to manual labor. Honest work, Dominic said quietly. Of course, Angelica agreed with mock sincerity. And I'm sure it suits you much better than all that corporate stress. Some people just aren't cut out for the pressure. The crowd around them had grown, drawn by the spectacle. Angelica felt the familiar rush of being the center of attention, especially when that attention came at someone else's expense. That's when they heard it, the distinctive sound of a helicopter approaching. The noise grew louder, causing conversations to pause throughout the ballroom. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, they could see spotlights illuminating the country club's grounds. Someone's making quite an entrance, Judge Hayden observed. The helicopter settled on the club's private landing area, and moments later, a figure emerged. Even from a distance, they could see it was a man in an expensive suit. He walked with purpose toward the club's main entrance. Probably one of the out-of-town donors, Rich speculated. The governor said he was expecting some major contributors tonight. But Angelica felt a strange chill as she watched the figure approach. Something about the man's bearing, his confident stride, seemed familiar. The ballroom doors opened, and the man entered. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. His hair was perfectly styled, and he moved through the crowd with the natural authority of someone accustomed to deference. But it was his face that made Angelica's blood run cold. Ladies and gentlemen, the club's general manager announced through the sound system, we're honored to welcome our evening's most generous contributor and the new majority shareholder of Morrison Industries, Chairman Dominic Dunn. The applause that followed seemed to echo from very far away. Angelica stared in disbelief as the man she'd been mocking moments before, the construction worker, the failure, the has-been, straightened his shoulders and smiled. Thank you all, Dominic said, his voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. My apologies for the dramatic entrance, but traffic was impossible. He reached up and adjusted his tie, a subtle gesture that somehow managed to draw attention to the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist and the perfectly tailored cut of his jacket. Then his eyes found Angelica's across the crowded room, and his smile widened. I hope I haven't missed anything important. Chapter 4. The chairman emerges. The silence that followed Dominic's announcement stretched like a taut wire across the ballroom. Angelica felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The careful world she'd constructed suddenly revealed as an illusion. Morrison Industries? Rich whispered, his face pale. That's impossible. Morrison was bought out 6 months ago by some private consortium. The new owner is anonymous, Dominic finished, having approached their group with the fluid confidence of a predator. Well, anonymous until tonight. Judge Hayden was the first to recover, extending his hand with the practiced grace of a politician. Chairman Dunn, we had no idea. What an honor to have you here. The honor is mine, Judge Hayden, Dominic replied, accepting the handshake. I've been following your judicial reforms with great interest. Perhaps we could discuss them over dinner sometime. Angelica watched in growing horror as the very people who had been witnesses to her humiliation of Dominic now fawned over him. Senator Sherman pushed through the crowd, her campaign-honed smile radiating false warmth. Mr. Chairman, she gushed, I can't tell you how pleased I am to finally meet you. Your donations to the Education Reform Bill were instrumental in its passage. Education is the foundation of everything, Senator, Dominic replied smoothly. Though I prefer to keep my political contributions private. Marla Stevenson, the mayor's wife, practically elbowed others aside to get closer. Chairman Dunn, my husband would be thrilled to discuss the downtown development project with you. I know you've been acquiring properties in that area. 60% of the commercial district, actually, Dominic said casually. I believe in investing in the community's future. Each revelation hit Angelica like a physical blow. 60% of downtown? Political donations large enough to influence legislation? This wasn't the man she'd divorced 3 years ago. Or rather, this wasn't the man she'd thought she'd divorced. How long have you been? Rich started, then stopped, seeming to realize the dangerous territory he was entering. chairman of Morrison Industries? Dominic's smile didn't reach his eyes. Officially, 6 months. Unofficially, I've been building toward this for years. Construction taught me a lot about foundations, you see. About building from the ground up. The words hit their target. Rich's hand tightened on his scotch glass, his knuckles white. He was beginning to understand the implications. I had no idea you were still in business, Angelica managed, her voice smaller than she intended. Oh, I never left business, Dominic replied, his tone conversational, but his eyes cold. I just learned to appreciate the value of discretion. Amazing what people will reveal when they think you're beneath their notice. Crystal Estes, the auction coordinator, appeared at Dominic's elbow with a nervous smile. Mr. Chairman, sir, we have the final auction item ready if you'd like to present it. Of course, Dominic said, though I believe there's been a change to the lot. He walked to the small stage where the auctioneer waited, and the crowd followed like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Angelica found herself pushed along by the movement, Rich beside her, both of them trapped in a waking nightmare. Ladies and gentlemen, Dominic announced, his voice carrying easily through the sound system. I've decided to make a special addition to tonight's auction. In addition to the items already cataloged, I'm donating something unique. A complete renovation of the Children's Hospital's East Wing, including state-of-the-art equipment and facilities. The crowd erupted in applause. The East Wing renovation had been discussed for years, but never funded due to its enormous cost, estimated at over $50 million. Furthermore, Dominic continued, Dunn Construction will handle the project personally. We've been quietly working on the plans for months, waiting for the right moment. More applause, louder this time. Angelica felt nauseous. Dunn Construction wasn't just a side business. It was a major operation, one sophisticated enough to handle a $50 million hospital project. However, Dominic said, and his voice took on a sharper edge, I do want to make one correction to something I heard earlier this evening. The applause died away, and an expectant hush fell over the crowd. I heard someone suggest that I've fallen since my divorce, Dominic continued, his eyes finding Angelica in the crowd, that I've been reduced to manual labor. I want to be clear. I choose to work construction sites because I believe in understanding every aspect of my business, from the foundation to the penthouse. He paused, letting the words sink in. I've learned that the people who built this city, the workers, the craftsmen, the ones with dirt under their fingernails, they have more integrity in their little finger than some people have in their entire bodies. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Angelica felt every eye in the room on her, and she knew they all remembered her words from earlier. Success, Dominic concluded, isn't about how high you climb. It's about how deep your foundations go. As he stepped down from the stage, approaches by dozens of well-wishers and business contacts, Angelica caught Rich's arm. We need to leave, she whispered urgently. But Rich was staring at Dominic with a look she'd never seen before, calculation mixed with fear. Rich, she said more forcefully. Let's go. We can't, he said quietly. Don't you understand? Morrison Industries handles 60% of our supply chain contracts. If he wanted to destroy Cole Enterprises, he didn't need to finish the sentence. They both understood the implications perfectly. They were trapped. Chapter 5, The Web Titans. The morning after the charity auction, Rich Cole sat in his office overlooking the city skyline. But for the first time in years, the view brought him no comfort. The newspapers scattered across his mahogany desk told the story in black and white. Mystery chairman revealed, construction worker to corporate giant, the rise of Dominic Dunn. Every article painted the same picture. A brilliant businessman who had systematically acquired control of major industries while maintaining the perfect disguise. The business journals were calling it the most sophisticated corporate strategy they'd seen in decades. Rich's assistant, Pamela Atkinson, knocked on the door before entering with another stack of messages. Her usually calm demeanor showed cracks of stress. Sir, Morrison Industries called again. They want to schedule a meeting about the Riverside development contracts. What did you tell them? That you were in meetings all day, but they were quite insistent. They said it was regarding the future of our partnership. Rich nodded grimly. Morrison Industries provided the steel and concrete for nearly all of Cole Enterprises' construction projects. If Dominic decided to terminate their relationship, it would cripple half of Rich's business operations. Also, Pamela continued, your banker called. Apparently, Someone has been inquiring about your credit lines and outstanding loans. Rich's blood chilled. In the world of corporate finance, such inquiries were rarely innocent. Someone was either planning to buy his debt or use his financial position against him. Who was asking? They wouldn't say, but Pamela hesitated. The timing seemed suspicious. Before Rich could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Rich Cole. Good morning, Rich. The voice was calm, measured, and unmistakably familiar. I hope you slept well after last night's festivities. Dominic. Rich's voice came out more strained than he intended. I was hoping we could meet for lunch today. There are some business matters I'd like to discuss. What kind of business matters? The kind that affect the future of Cole Enterprises. Shall we say the Riverside Club at 1 o'clock? The line went dead before Rich could respond. Meanwhile, across town, Angelica paced the marble floors of the penthouse she shared with Rich, her designer heels clicking against the stone. She'd spent the morning fielding calls from friends and social acquaintances, each conversation more humiliating than the last. The worst had been Marla Stevenson, who'd called with thinly veiled glee to inform her that the Ladies' Auxiliary had voted to make Chairman Dunn their guest of honor at next month's gala. Of course, we'll understand if you prefer not to attend, Marla had said with false sympathy. Given the awkwardness of the situation, Angelica had hung up without responding. Now she stood at the window, looking down at the construction site where she'd seen Dominic just days before. Workers moved like ants around the foundation of what would become a luxury hotel. A hotel that, she now realized, was probably one of his projects. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Coffee? The place on 5th Street where we had our first date. 3 p.m. She deleted the message immediately, but her hands were shaking. At exactly 1 o'clock, Rich Cole entered the Riverside Club's dining room to find Dominic already seated at a corner table, studying a leather portfolio. He looked up as Rich approached, his expression pleasant but unreadable. Rich, thank you for coming. Please sit. Rich took the chair across from him, acutely aware that several other diners were watching their interaction with barely concealed curiosity. I'll cut to the chase, Dominic said, closing the portfolio. Cole Enterprises is in trouble. I don't know what you're talking about. Your Riverside development project is 3 months behind schedule and running 60% over budget. Your primary investor, the Blackstone Group, is getting nervous about their returns. And your supply contracts with Morrison Industries are up for renewal next month. Rich's mouth went dry. Everything Dominic had said was accurate, but that information wasn't public knowledge. How do you know all this? Dominic smiled. Rich, I've been watching Cole Enterprises for 2 years. Every project, every contract, every financial decision. Did you really think I'd let the man who broke up my marriage operate without oversight? The words hung in the air like a blade. What do you want? Rich asked finally. Justice, Dominic replied simply. You see, when you decided to seduce my wife, you made a critical error in judgment. You assumed I was weak, that I would simply accept the situation and move on with my life. Rich started to speak, but Dominic held up a hand. I'm not finished. You and Angelica took everything you thought mattered, the house, the social status, the respectability. But you left me with something far more valuable. What? Motivation, Dominic said, his voice cold as winter, and the intelligence to use it properly. He opened the portfolio and slid a document across the table. Rich scanned it quickly, his face growing paler with each line. This is a comprehensive analysis of Cole Enterprises' vulnerabilities, Dominic explained. Financial weaknesses, legal liabilities, operational inefficiencies. Everything I need to systematically dismantle your company. You can't. Can't what? Can't refuse to renew your supply contracts? Can't share my concerns about your financial stability with the Blackstone Group? Can't encourage the City Planning Commission to take a closer look at your building permits? Each question hit like a physical blow. All of which, Dominic continued, would be perfectly legal business decisions. Rich stared at the document, understanding with growing horror that he was looking at his own corporate death warrant. However, Dominic said, his tone softening slightly, I'm not unreasonable. We can discuss alternatives. What kind of alternatives? Dominic's smile was sharp as a razor's edge. The kind that acknowledge who's really in control now. Chapter 6. The First Strike. Angelica sat in the small coffee shop on 5th Street, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. She'd told herself she wouldn't come, had spent 2 hours pacing the penthouse, but something had compelled her here. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the desperate need to understand how completely she'd misjudged the man she'd been married to for 8 years. When Dominic walked in, she almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the construction worker from the previous day and the polished chairman from the auction. This version of Dominic wore dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt, looking like the man she'd fallen in love with in college. He ordered a black coffee and sat across from her without ceremony. "You came," he said simply. "I shouldn't have. But you did." He studied her face with those dark eyes she'd once found so compelling. "Do you know why?" "Curiosity, I suppose." "No," Dominic said quietly. "Guilt." The word hit harder than she'd expected. Angelica straightened in her chair, summoning the defensive armor that had carried her through countless social battles. "I have nothing to feel guilty about. Our marriage was over long before Rich came along." "Was it?" Dominic asked. "Or did you just decide it was easier to find someone new than work on what we had?" "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't sit there and pretend you were the perfect husband. You were always working, always distracted by your projects and your construction sites." "Building our future," Dominic replied. "Something you never seemed to appreciate." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years and betrayal hanging between them. "How long?" Angelica asked finally. "How long what? How long have you been planning this? The construction worker thing, the secret business empire, last night's revelation. How long have you been planning to humiliate me?" Dominic leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Humiliation was never the goal, Angelica. That was just a side effect." "Then what is the goal?" "Justice," he said, the same word he'd used with Rich. "You and Rich destroyed my life based on the assumption that I was weak, that I would simply disappear and let you build your perfect new existence on the ruins of our marriage. We never asked you to disappear, didn't you?" Dominic's voice hardened. "The way you paraded around town with him before the divorce was even final? The way you made sure everyone knew you'd traded up? The way you talked about me at parties, at the country club, to anyone who would listen?" Angelica felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had done all of those things, but at the time they'd felt justified. Necessary, even. "I learned things about myself during our divorce," Dominic continued. "I learned that I'm not as forgiving as I thought. I learned that I don't forget. And I learned that revenge, properly executed, is its own form of art. What are you going to do to us?" "Nothing you don't deserve," Dominic said, his tone conversational. "Rich is about to discover that his business empire is built on sand." The Blackstone Group received some very interesting information about Cole Enterprises' financial irregularities this morning. "What irregularities?" "The ones that happen when you cut corners on safety inspections, use substandard materials, and bribe city officials for permits." Dominic's smile was cold. Amazing what a thorough audit can uncover. Angelica's coffee cup clattered against the saucer as her hands began to shake. "You're lying." "Am I? Why don't you call Rich and ask him about his lunch meeting?" As if summoned by his words, Angelica's phone rang. Rich's name appeared on the screen. "Take it," Dominic suggested. With trembling fingers, Angelica answered. "Rich. Angel, we need to talk." "Where are you?" "I'm out." "What's wrong?" "You sound terrible." "The Blackstone Group just pulled out of the Riverside project. They're demanding an immediate audit of our books and threatening to go to the authorities about the permit situation." Angelica's eyes met Dominic's across the table. He was watching her with the patience of a spider studying a fly in its web. "How is that possible?" she whispered into the phone. "Someone gave them information. Detailed information about things that should have been private. Angel, I think we're in serious trouble." The call ended, and Angelica stared at the phone in her hand. "That's just the beginning," Dominic said quietly. "Rich built his success on cutting corners and exploiting relationships. I simply provided interested parties with accurate information about his business practices." "You destroyed him." "No," Dominic corrected. "I revealed him. There's a difference." Angelica felt the walls of her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. "What about me? What about you? Are you going to destroy me too?" Dominic was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. "You already destroyed yourself, Angelica. You chose a man you thought could give you a better life, but you never bothered to learn who he really was. Rich Cole is everything I'm not. Flashy, superficial, and ultimately hollow. You traded substance for appearance. And now you're taking even that away from me. I'm showing you the truth, Dominic said. What you do with it is your choice. He stood to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, I loved you once. Completely, unconditionally. But that man died the day I saw those pictures. The man you're dealing with now. He's someone else entirely. As he walked away, Angelica understood with crystal clarity that her old life was over. The question now was whether she would have any life at all when Dominic was finished with his revenge. Chapter 7. The Empire Crumbles. Within 72 hours of his lunch with Dominic, Rich Cole's world had collapsed with the precision of a controlled demolition. The Blackstone Group had not only withdrawn from the Riverside project, but had also frozen all of Cole Enterprises' accounts pending a federal investigation into construction fraud. The FBI had raided his offices, seizing computers and files dating back 5 years. Rich sat in his attorney's office, watching Edmund Stokes pace behind his mahogany desk. Edmund was the best corporate lawyer money could buy, but even he looked defeated. The evidence is overwhelming, Edmund said, stopping to face his client. Financial records, email communications, recorded phone calls. They have documentation of every corner you've cut, every bribe you've paid, every safety regulation you've ignored. How is that possible? Rich asked, though he already knew the answer. Someone with extensive resources and unlimited patience has been building a case against you for years. This isn't a random audit, Rich. This is a coordinated attack. On the desk between them lay copies of the federal charges: conspiracy, fraud, bribery, criminal negligence. Each count carried a potential sentence of 10 to 20 years. What are my options? Edmund sat down heavily. Honestly, hope for a plea bargain and pray they don't decide to make an example of you. Meanwhile, Angelica stood in the penthouse that would soon no longer be hers, watching the news coverage of Rich's downfall on every channel. The reporters had dubbed it the Cole collapse, and the story had captured the public imagination. A wealthy CEO brought down by his own corruption. But Angelica knew better. This wasn't about justice or accountability. This was about Dominic Dunn's need for revenge, executed with the patience and precision of a master strategist. Her phone had been ringing all day, reporters seeking comment, former friends distancing themselves, creditors demanding payment on accounts that Rich could no longer cover. She'd stopped answering hours ago. The doorbell rang, and Angelica's heart jumped. For a moment, she wondered if it might be Dominic, coming to gloat over his victory. Instead, she found Brandon Hutchins standing in the hallway, his construction supervisor uniform replaced by a well-tailored suit. "Mrs. Cole," he said politely, "Mr. Dunn sent me to deliver this." He handed her an envelope with her name written in Dominic's familiar handwriting. "Who are you really?" she asked as Brandon turned to leave. "I'm exactly who I've always been," he replied. "The difference is, now you know who Mr. Dunn really is." After he left, Angelica opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a key. "Angelica, by the time you read this, Rich will be in federal custody. The charges against him are substantial and well documented. His conviction is inevitable. I thought you should know that none of this was random. Every decision he made that led to his downfall was influenced by information I provided, opportunities one created, or pressures I applied. I've been orchestrating his destruction for 3 years. You were collateral damage in a war you didn't even know was being fought. The key is to a storage unit downtown. Unit 247. Inside, you'll find enough cash to start over somewhere far from here. Consider it a severance package from our marriage. Don't mistake this for forgiveness. I'm giving you this opportunity because the woman I once loved is buried somewhere beneath the person you've become. Maybe if you lose everything that never really mattered, you'll find her again. Don't try to contact me. Don't try to thank me. Just disappear. D." Angelica read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Dominic had won completely. Rich was facing decades in prison. Cole Enterprises was being liquidated by federal authorities, and she was being offered exile with enough money to survive, but never again to matter. The television in the background continued its coverage of Rich's perp walk, the images of him in handcuffs playing on an endless loop. In every shot, he looked broken, aged 10 years in as many hours. That evening, as federal agents began seizing assets from the penthouse, Angelica made her way to the storage facility. Unit 247 contained exactly what Dominic had promised, several $1 million in cash, carefully packaged and laundered through legitimate business transactions. There was also a folder containing new identity documents, a car title, and reservations at a small coastal town in Oregon where nobody would know her name or her history. As she loaded the money into the car Dominic had provided, Angelica realized that her ex-husband had planned even this moment with meticulous care. He'd known she would have no choice but to take his offering, no matter how much it stung her pride. The final item in the storage unit was a photograph, their wedding picture, the one that had sat on their mantelpiece for 8 years. On the back, Dominic had written a single line, "Remember who you used to be." Angelica stared at the image of her younger self, radiant in white lace, looking at Dominic with genuine love and hope. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. As she drove away from the city that had been her home for 15 years, Angelica understood that Dominic's revenge was complete. He hadn't just destroyed her life. He'd forced her to confront who she'd become and given her one last chance to become someone else. Whether she would take that chance remained to be seen. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. 6 months after Rich Cole's conviction and sentencing to 18 years in federal prison, the city had largely forgotten about the scandal. News stories dominated the headlines, new socialites filled the charity auction circuit, and life moved on with the relentless indifference of time. But in the executive boardroom of Morrison Industries, Dominic Dunn was far from finished. The Hong Kong expansion is proceeding ahead of schedule, reported Pamela Atkinson, who had become his chief operating officer after demonstrating remarkable adaptability during the transition from Rich's employ. The Singapore office opens next month, and we have preliminary agreements in place for projects in Dubai and Sao Paulo. Dominic nodded, making notes on his tablet. Morrison Industries had tripled in size since he'd taken control, expanding from regional construction and development into a global conglomerate. The revenge against Rich had been just the beginning. Every victory, every acquisition, every success was another step away from the man who had once been humiliated at a charity auction. What about the Riverside development? Complete, said Brandon Hutchins, now director of operations. The hotel opens next week, and we're already booking events for the next 18 months. The mayor wants to use it for the Economic Development Summit. It was a perfect irony. The hotel that Rich Cole had failed to complete now stood as a monument to Dominic's success, rising from the same ground where Cole Enterprises had collapsed. Any word from Oregon? Dominic asked quietly. Brandon consulted his notes. She's working at a small accounting firm in Bandon. Lives in a modest apartment, drives a used car, keeps to herself. No contact with anyone from her previous life. Dominic had maintained surveillance on Angelica not out of continued revenge, but from something more complex, a need to know that his mercy had been worthwhile. So far, the reports suggested she was building a genuinely different life, one based on actual work rather than social climbing. Sir, Pamela interrupted. There's someone here to see you. She says it's personal. Before Dominic could respond, the conference room door opened and Judge Patrick Hayden's daughter, Jody Sherman, entered. At 32, she was a successful attorney in her own right, specializing in corporate law and completely unimpressed by wealth or status. Chairman Dunn, she said with a slight smile, I hope you don't mind the interruption. Not at all, Senator Sherman, Dominic replied, though he was surprised by her presence. To what do I owe the pleasure? Actually, it's Attorney Sherman now. I resigned from the Senate last month to return to private practice. She glanced around the boardroom. Mind if we speak privately? Dominic dismissed his staff with a nod, then gestured for Jody to take a seat at the conference table. I've been following your story, she began without preamble. The rise from construction worker to corporate chairman, the revenge against your ex-wife and her boyfriend, the transformation of Morrison Industries into a global powerhouse. And I'm curious about what comes next. Dominic studied her face, noting the intelligence in her green eyes and the confidence in her posture. Jody Sherman had never been part of the social circle that had excluded and mocked him, but she'd been present at the charity auction, had witnessed his revelation. What makes you think there's a next? Because revenge is a finite game, she said simply. You've won completely. Rich Cole is in prison, your ex-wife is in exile, and you've built an empire that makes their former lifestyle look quaint. The question is, what does a man do after he's conquered everything he set out to conquer? It was a question Dominic had been asking himself more frequently. The satisfaction of victory had been real, but surprisingly brief. Each new success felt hollow compared to the intensity of purpose that had driven him during his years of planning. Perhaps he finds new goals, Dominic suggested. Or perhaps he realizes that revenge was never really what he wanted. Jody leaned forward slightly. I've been watching you at various events over the past few months. You look like a man who's won a war, but lost sight of why he was fighting. Her observation hit closer to home than Dominic cared to admit. What would you suggest? That you consider the possibility that the best revenge is living well, not just appearing to live well. She stood to leave, then paused. There's a difference between building something for spite and building something for joy. After she left, Dominic sat alone in the conference room, looking out at the city skyline. Every building in his view was somehow connected to his business empire, projects he'd funded, properties he'd acquired, developments he'd influenced. But Jody was right. He'd won everything he'd set out to win, destroyed everyone who had wronged him, and built an empire that commanded respect across the globe. Yet somewhere in the process, he'd lost track of what he actually wanted from life. That evening, Dominic found himself walking through the construction site where he'd been working the day before the charity auction. The luxury hotel was complete now, its glass facade reflecting the city lights, but the foundation remained exactly as he'd built it, solid, deep, and permanent. His phone buzzed with a message from his security team. Subject in Oregon has enrolled in night school. Business degree program. Dominic deleted the message and made a decision. It was time to stop watching Angelica's new life and start building his own. Chapter 9. The Chairman's Piece. 2 years later, Dominic stood in the same ballroom where his old life had ended and his new one had begun. The Riverside Country Club's annual charity auction was in full swing. But this time, he was there not as a revelation or a weapon, but simply as a man who had learned the difference between winning and being happy. Morrison Industries now operated on 6 continents, employed over 50,000 people, and had become synonymous with ethical business practices and community development. The company's charitable foundation, endowed with $3 billion, funded education initiatives worldwide. But the real change was in Dominic himself. Gone was the cold calculation that had driven his revenge, replaced by something more sustainable, purpose that extended beyond personal vendetta. The children's wing is officially open, reported Dr. Jean King, the chief administrator of the Children's Hospital. The staff is calling it a miracle of modern design. We can't thank you enough. It was my pleasure, Dominic replied, and meant it. The hospital project had evolved far beyond his original donation, becoming a comprehensive medical complex that served the entire region. Dominic, called a familiar voice from across the room. Judge Patrick Hayden approached with his characteristic dignity, but his expression was warmer than it had been during their previous encounters. I wanted to thank you personally for the Judicial Reform Initiative. The state Supreme Court says it's already improving case processing times. Good governance benefits everyone, Dominic said simply. As Judge Hayden moved on to other conversations, Dominic noticed Jody Sherman approaching from the auction display. She looked elegant in a simple black dress, her attorney's confidence softened by genuine warmth. Mr. Chairman, she said with mock formality, fancy meeting you here. Attorney Sherman, he replied with a slight smile. How's private practice treating you? Wonderfully, especially since I've been able to represent some very interesting clients. She paused meaningfully. Including a certain small accounting firm in Oregon that's been receiving anonymous legal services. Dominic's expression didn't change, but Jody's smile suggested she'd noticed his subtle reaction. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you don't. Just like you don't know anything about the scholarship fund for non-traditional students at Oregon Coast Community College, or the anonymous benefactor who paid for a certain someone's business degree. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the auction proceedings. She graduated last month, Jody said quietly. Summa cum laude. Started her own firm specializing in helping small businesses with their finances. Good for her. The surveillance reports stopped 6 months ago. Did they? Yes, Jody said, turning to face him directly. About the same time you asked me to handle those legal matters in Oregon. About the same time you stopped being the man who destroyed rich coal and started being the man who builds children's hospitals. Dominic met her gaze, seeing understanding there instead of judgment. People change, he said finally. Some people, Jody agreed. The ones who are strong enough to let go of their anger when it stops serving them. The auction was reaching its climax, with bidding on a luxury vacation package pushing past $50,000. Dominic watched the proceedings with detached interest, remembering the night when this same room had witnessed his transformation from victim to victor. What would you say, Jody asked carefully, to the idea of dinner sometime? Not as attorney and client, not as social acquaintances, but as two people who might enjoy each other's company. Dominic considered the question, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, anticipation unconnected to revenge or business strategy. I'd say that sounds like the beginning of something new. Good, Jody said with a smile that reached her eyes. Because I think you've spent enough time looking backward. As the auction continued around them, Dominic realized that Jody was right. The man who had orchestrated Rich Cole's downfall and Angelica's exile had accomplished everything he'd set out to do. That chapter of his life was complete. What came next would be written by a different version of himself, one who had learned that true power wasn't about destroying enemies, but about building something worthy of the strength it had taken to survive their betrayal. The charity auction raised over $10 million that night, with Dominic contributing another $5 million to ensure every goal was exceeded. But the real victory was smaller and more personal. The moment when he realized he was no longer the man defined by what had been done to him, but by what he chose to do next. As he and Jody left the ballroom together, Dominic caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirrored wall. The man looking back at him was confident, successful, and at peace. Everything he'd always had the potential to become, once he'd stopped letting other people's choices determine his worth. The foundation he'd built during those dark years of planning revenge had proven strong enough to support something better, a life defined not by the wrongs done to him, but by the good he chose to do in return. Chairman Dominic Dunn had finally learned the difference between conquest and contentment. And for the first time in years, that was enough. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.